Amen. Good Father. The minor prophets. I'll be honest, I'm pretty excited about these next several weeks because you know that you know my love for the Old Testament. And I know I've said this 1,000 times before, but churches that like to refer to themselves as we are a New Testament church. Whenever you hear that, you have to be like, be very wary, because that shows, in my opinion, a lack of understanding. Because the Old Testament and the New Testament, guess what? They're the same story. All 66 books, starting out at Genesis and ending at Revelation, it's one collection of 66 books. It's a love song from the beginning to the end. It all speaks of Yahweh. It all speaks of Christ, the Redeemer of His people. So these next several weeks, as we look at the minor prophets, we're going to look at some things that are very relevant to your walk with the Lord. Things that to be honest, some of these minor prophets, we like to pick little pieces out of what they have to say, because sometimes we get little things from the minor prophets, like talking about the birth of Christ, being at the town of Bethlehem, or the city of David. We like to pick these little things up, but we never really look at the meat of what the minor prophets are saying. And we're going to look at a lot of scripture today, because we're going to get to a spot where we're going to be reading a lot, because this is a conversation that there are very important things in this conversation I don't want you to miss. Well, first of all, who is Habakkuk? Who is this? Who is this guy? Assuming I'm saying his name right. I've heard it pronounced different ways. But Habakkuk, or Habakkuk, he prophesied about 600 years before Christ came. Usually people say it's about 604, 605 BC is when Habakkuk when this book was written, when he started to prophesy to the people of Israel. And probably the most significant historical event that was going on at this time was the time leading up to and shortly after the attack of Babylon on Judah and exiling her people. So interestingly enough, we really don't see, the Bible refers to Habakkuk as a prophet, so we know he had stuff to say. I mean, that's what a prophet is. A prophet is somebody who is the mouthpiece of God, that has something to say to the people of God on God's behalf. But we really don't see that in this book. What we see, and this was really kind of unique about the book of Habakkuk, is it's not, woe is you, turn back, repent, none of this stuff. We see flavors of it, but it's actually a conversation between God and His prophet. That's what the whole book is. It's only 3 chapters, and it's not a long book. And if you remember me talking about this, what makes minor prophets minor prophets? It's the size of their book. The 12 minor prophets is because of these 12 prophets, their books are smaller than some of the monsters. What I call the monsters. The Isaiahs. That's a long book. Jeremiah. Some of these. Daniel. Some of these prophets had a lot to say, and their books are large, and that's why we call them the major prophets. But these minor prophets, what they have to say isn't minor material. It's not insignificant things. The minor prophets just have smaller books. So his contemporaries, Habakkuk's contemporaries, would have been Zephaniah, which is another one of the minors, but it was also Jeremiah. Did we ever see anything big come out of Jeremiah? What you look at, great is thy faithfulness. That hymn comes straight out of the writings of Jeremiah and Jeremiah's writings in Lamentations. So we see he did have a contemporary that we know well. And I pointed this out, and I'm just going to quickly mention it again, because again, this is going to be, we're going to get to a point where we're going to read a lot quickly, because there's pieces of this conversation that I think are too important. This whole book is a conversation. So the big theme that stands out for me in this book, because each of these prophets, something really just jumps out. There's themes, there's things that are very important, but one of the things that jumps out at me the most about the book of Habakkuk is that God is okay with you asking Him hard questions. Have you ever been taught Have you ever heard that it's not okay to question God? So I've heard that many a times. It's almost like some people will say it's almost blasphemous to ask God a question that's a hard question that might kind of downplay who He is. But it's not a bad thing to ask God big questions. Because here's the thing, if you're having a doubt, has anybody here ever doubted God? Yeah. If you ever have a doubt, what's better, to ignore that doubt and just let that thing fester, or to bring it to the Lord and say, okay, God, I'm having issues with this. I just don't get this. Why are you doing it this way? Why is it happening that way? This doesn't make sense to me. If you are who you say you are, I think it would go a different way. God's not intimidated by your big questions. He's got broad shoulders. He gave you a free will. He gave you a mind to think with. So when you give somebody a free will and a thinking brain, guess what's going to happen? You're going to come up with big, hard questions. And that's what Habakkuk was doing. And it's okay. It's okay to bring these hard things to God. If something's bothering you, bring it to it. So this is part of Habakkuk's, this is kind of his problem. And this is why this book is so important to me, because I can understand where he's coming from. I understand, what his complaint is to God. Because when we look at Habakkuk, let's put a little history behind it. I've told you that, he was prophesying. This book was written about 600 years before the coming of Christ. It was as the Babylonian, exile was upon them. What else had been happening before this? Before the Babylonian Empire or exile, which took the last two kingdoms, or the lower kingdom of Israel, the last two tribes of Israel, what happened before that? Assyria came and they took the top 10, the northern kingdom. So this was even known that he was speaking to the southern kingdom, and he was talking to God before the southern kingdom was taken. They would have been well aware of what just happened up north, because to be honest, they had a lot to do with it. The king of the southern kingdom at this point, he was scared of the other 10 tribes because they were powerful. They were united. There was 10 of them. So he actually strikes a deal. The king of Judah, the southern kingdom, actually struck a deal with the king of Assyria, which resulted in the exile of the whole top 10 tribes. So everybody in the southern kingdom would have known what happened. So it's troubling times. Many of God's people were now in exile in Assyria under these horrible people. And now all of a sudden, and here's the thing about the Babylonian captivity. Nebuchadnezzar, when he finally said, I've had enough, and Babylon came in and destroyed the first temple, and he hauled off God's people, there were other occasions where he came up and he kind of challenged them. And he told them, I need you to comply with this, that, or another. So it was almost like he was almost warning them, this is bad things can happen if you don't kind of fall in line. So now when we see this is as the final straw had broken the camel's back, and Nebuchadnezzar had enough. And this is when he's coming in to finally take the rest of God's people into captivity. So it was troubling times. So Habakkuk would have had all this in his mind. So he says, how long, Lord, must I call for your help, but you do not listen? Have you ever asked God that? If you say you've never asked God, how long do I have to keep praying to you before you respond to me? If you say that you've never said that, you're probably lying. I wish I had $1 for every time that I've talked to God. It's just like, how many times do I have to bring this to you, Lord? How many times? Have you ever thought, God, are you listening? This is what he's asking. Are you not even listening to me? That's what Habakkuk's saying here. He said, how long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? He'd seen a lot of violence. Why do you make me look at injustice? You see why this might be something that resonates with me a little bit? I'm getting to be an old guy in a career where I've seen a lot of injustice. I've seen people doing people wrong. And I've seen courts fail those victims time and time again. I get this. What is the injustices he's talking? He's talking about even greater injustices. He's talking about people being murdered. He's talking about people that are being dragged off from their home country. He's seen these horrible injustices. But I get, if you see injustice for so long, it wears on you. There have been days, there have been years, and you can see it in my activity, in my other job. I'll be busy, arrest, write tickets, and boom. And it's just like, does Greg even still work here anymore? Why is it? Because I go through those points where it's just like, why am I even doing this? You know what I'm talking about. Why am I even doing this? God, Habakkuk I connect with him. Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? You know, when I look at the things, when I look at what's going on in Israel, why does Iran keep being able to do the stuff Iran does? Yeah, we're kind of tightening the noose a little bit, but it's still going on. Why is Russia still in the Ukraine? Why? And I'll tell you what, these are the things, these are big players that we pay a lot of attention to because they affect us. There's an entire continent of Africa where things are going, where injustice lives every day, and it doesn't even make the news because it's not important to our way of life. But injustice happens nonstop. Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore, the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. Have you ever felt this way? God, are you listening? Are you listening? There's so much bad stuff going on, God. You know what? I've even questioned, not so much questioned as been upset with God over natural things. You know, God, why do typhoons happen? Why do wildfires happen? Why do people get displaced? Why do animals get burned alive? Why do people get victimized in horrible ways by other people? God, why? And I'll be honest, there are times that I just get heavy in heart because it's just like, God, when will it end? When will it end? Do you think this is a hard thing that Habakkuk brought before the Lord? Do you think God is okay with him asking this? So God answers. This is kind of cool. He says, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I am rising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. So now all of a sudden, there's another whole dimension going on here. So now all of a sudden, God is telling him, guess what? You're going to see something big. In your lifetime, you're going to see something big. You're going to see me take control of this situation. But he's answering the question with an answer that Habakkuk would never have accepted as being a good answer. He says, I'm raising up the Babylonians. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. That's your answer, the Babylonians? In fact, God, he drives home. He keeps talking. He understands what they're all about. God continues, they are feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves to promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. And this is God talking. They come in with the intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all the fortified cities by building earthen ramps. They capture them. They sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose strength is their own God. So when God is saying, I'm rising up the Babylonians, he gets what he's doing. He gets what he's doing. And he's saying, I get that these people are not good people. They're mean, they're fierce, people are scared of them, they do these horrible things, but I'm going to put them in a position of power. So if I was in Habakkuk's shoes, I'd be like, what in the world, God? This isn't the answer I was looking for. If I was Habakkuk, I might have even been thinking, how about the Messiah? You know, the Messiah, how about sending him right now? Let him rescue us from this thing. But I'll tell you what, the Babylonians were the way the Babylonians were because they had free will. They had the ability to choose their own way. They had the ability to use violence and be fierce, to take what they wanted. But I mentioned earlier that Assyria had taken the northern kingdom. So God had a plan. And it's easier to see this when we're looking back. For Habakkuk, this would have been like, it's so easy sometimes in my life, looking back in the past, and like, okay, I see what God was doing there. But when I was in the moment, I'm like, God, do you know what you're doing here? So when he said, I'm rising up the Babylonians, well, looking back, I could see what was God doing. The Assyrians were mean, nasty people. They dashed babies on rocks to break your spirit. They did all these horrible things. So for God to capture back or to free his people, he had to allow a force greater than the Assyrians to rise up. So what did he do? Even though he didn't say, I like your methodology, I'm cool with the way you do things, he says, I'm going to use you. I'm going to use you to conquer the Assyrians. And he did just that. So the Babylonians came, he rose up the Babylonians, they came, they took the southern kingdom. So now all of a sudden, Babylon conquers Assyria. So now what do we have again? Who was already in the captivity of the Assyrians? God used the Babylonians to unite his people again. All 12 tribes were once together again, now in the exile of one nation, Babylon. He raised up a people he knew that would deal with the issue of Assyria, and they did very well. They conquered these monstrous people. Now the 12 tribes are together again. So let's look forward just for a second. God knowing what he's doing. So now, first of all, he didn't just hand over his people to Nebuchadnezzar and not deal with Nebuchadnezzar. Do you remember the stories of Nebuchadnezzar? Do you remember Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego? The three young Jewish boys thrown in the fire, the fourth man in the fire? Do you remember those stories? Do you remember that when Nebuchadnezzar's head was getting big and he was all puffed up, God struck him with basically a mental illness where he was like acting like a wild animal, eating grass, and he spent years like this. And then God restored his mind, and Nebuchadnezzar was like, all right, he is the living God. So God didn't just give up on his people. He was dealing with the Babylonians even when they were in charge. Well, guess what he did after that? He raised up somebody strong enough to take over the Babylonians. He might not agree with the way the Persians dealt with things, but guess what? He raised them up. They conquered Babylon, and now the Jewish people were in the custody or under exile under the Persian people. So God knowing what's God doing, what did the Persian people do? Remember Nehemiah? Who was Nehemiah? Who actually he had the ear of the king of Persia. And he approached him. It's like he just seemed so downcast. And the king, and that could have been a dangerous thing. You were not a Debbie Downer to the king because he could kill you just because you made him feel uncomfortable. But to even approach the king in a way where you just look downcast. And the king's like, what's up, buddy? Why are you so downtrodden? What? He's like, you know what? I want to take my people home. And what does the king do? Okay. So he gets even braver. It's like, I want the stuff to do it. And the king's like, okay. He gives him material. He lets people go. All of a sudden, they're trekking back. God knew what he was doing. He raised nations up to conquer nations and put his people in the exile or the custody of the Persians, who eventually let them go home. So what was the next nation he really rose up? Well, the Greeks. What came after the Greeks? God raising up people to get his will done. He doesn't necessarily have to agree with the way they do things, but he still uses even these hard things. He eventually rose up, guess what? The Roman Empire. He let them come to power. Make no mistake, the Romans could not have come into power without God okaying it. What happened ultimately under the Romans? He sent his son to be a sacrifice, and he set his people free from their sin. So just like Habakkuk, so many times we're just like, and I know this was a history lesson I wasn't really planning on, but it shows that even when we don't understand why God does what God does, he has a plan. He never goes into a situation without knowing exactly how he's going to work it out. So sometimes we just have to have a little bit of faith. So now all of a sudden, God tells, so Habakkuk saying, God, why are you not listening? Why do I see all this injustice? And God said, I'm raising up the Babylonians. So now Habakkuk responds to that. He said, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You have appointed, let's emphasize them. You have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on the evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Then why do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those who are more righteous than themselves? And Habakkuk goes on. He says, you have made people like the sea, like the fish of the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his nets and gathers them up in this dragnet, and he rejoices and is so glad. Therefore, he sacrifices to his nets and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury, enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? So what is Habakkuk saying? God's saying, I'm raising up the Babylonians. He's like, how can you do that? He says, you're the everlasting God. You know what you're doing. How can you use these people for your will? God, have you fallen and bumped your head on something up in heaven? This doesn't make sense to me. Because these people, they revel in their own power. They devour everyone. They just take what they want, and they burn offerings to their nets, their own power and their own strength. God's even pointed out earlier, their power is their own God. And Habakkuk is kind of parroting this very idea that how can you let this happen? God answers back. And this, I think, is really cool. He's like, you can take this to the bank. God's now going to say, you can take this to the bank. Write this thing down. Write it down. He says, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end that will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. So okay, let's step back for a second. God's saying, you know what? I know that you don't get this. He said, but write this thing down because you're going to see it come to pass. He said, and here's an important thing. This is something that we were talking about in Sunday school the last week or two. The revelation awaits its appointed time. So sometimes when we talk to God and we pray to God and we're like, why? How can my life be so terrible? How can all these things be happening in my country? How can all these things be happening in my community? How can all these things be happening in my life? Why? When? God's saying, guess what? I'm going to take care of this, but it's in my time. Because I know the appointed time. I know when the fullness of time is. And guess what? God is always on time. I never agree with God's time frame. I never, ever agree with God's time frame. But why is that? Because I want things in my time because I know how they affect me, and I want the uncomfortable stuff to go away and me feel good. I want what I want, and I want it now. I don't want to have to wait days or weeks or months or years. And God's like, no. I'm working this out. I'm working out the details. And when the fullness of time comes, when the appointed time comes, I will execute that plan. And there will be no question about where that plan originated. So God explains to Habakkuk that he does see their wicked acts and justice is coming. He says, see, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright. But the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. Indeed, wine betrays him. He is arrogant and never is at rest. Because he is as greedy as the grave, and he's like death who is never satisfied, he gathers to himself all the nations and take captives all the people. So God's saying, I get it. I get the situation. I get who I'm dealing with here. But I'm just going to skip down through a few different things to show where God knows. He says, woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. And I put all these scripture references on these so you can look at them if you want. He also says later, because you have plundered many nations, the peoples who are left will plunder you. He also says, woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. But here's the mic drop moment. At the end of chapter 2, and we're not done yet. The mic drop moment, the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. What is Habakkuk saying? God is on his throne. He knows what he's doing. Be still. This isn't Habakkuk. Be still and know that I am God. Also understand that the rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous alike. See how all these books